When I'm not feeling inspired, the last thing I want to do is spend hours in a drum rack trying to draw in percussion grooves. So in this video, I'm going to show you a different way to approach that. I'm going to show you how to take entire loops and turn them into your own unique percussion grooves using a very interesting device called battery. So let's dive in. All I have prepared is this 4x4 kick groove. BPM is 108. Can't get any simpler than that. And the usual approach would be to step by step add elements to your groove, like the hi-hat, clap, toms, percussion. But that's not what I'm looking for today. Today I want to take a more generative approach. So what I will do is create a MIDI track. In this MIDI track, we're going to load a battery. This device is by Native Instruments. I believe it's also included in one of their complete collections. It's definitely worth checking out. It's a drum rack with a bit more functions. Also comes with a ton of these different kits. Surely fun to mess around with. And you might have a few loops laying around from different sound packs, but you don't know how to use them exactly. You don't want to end up just dragging and dropping them in like this and using the loop as a whole. So how do you turn this into something more unique? So what I'm going to do is take a couple of these tribal percussion loops and put them into these pads of the battery rack over here. And I'm going to go through a couple different folders and maybe also add a few toms. Doesn't really matter, just chuck them in, see what we can come up with. And perhaps even some subtle percussion loops, why not? Let's just chuck them in there. So now we have a drum rack or battery loaded up with all these different percussion sounds, all these different loops. But how do we turn that into something usable now? In this panel on the left, you get these clips, these MIDI clips that are in Ableton Live. They're included in Ableton Live. You can simply drag and drop them and you already get a starting point for your groove here. And since we've used loops and not one-shots, the issue is that if we now hit one of these pads, the whole entire loop plays from start to finish. Which we don't want, right? We just want to have a certain section of this loop to be played as if it were a one-shot. So what we're going to do is highlight all of these pads. Basically just shift click and that'll highlight all the individual pads within that drum rack. And now we can edit them together. And it's pretty easy to do in battery. You just want to enable the envelope, the volume envelope, and put it into ADSR mode. We're going to crank down the sustain to -infinity and also reduce the decay down a bit. Now, if we play the percussions, it'll play each and every single sound at the beginning with these amplitude envelope settings. You can also dial down the release and it'll even play shorter parts of the sound then, starting from the beginning, of course. But what if we don't want the sounds to start from the beginning? What if we want the position to be always randomized? Therefore, again, select all your sounds, go into modulation, modulation slots. Now select velocity over here, map it to the sample start. So every time we hit one of these pads, depending on the velocity, depending on how hard we hit the note, it'll start at a different position. So if we hit it softly, it'll start at the beginning. And if we hit it really intensely, it'll start somewhere towards the middle or somewhere towards the end. If I record arm this track over here and start playing it on my keyboard, now I'm playing it really softly. And now I'm playing it really intensely. It'll trigger a different section of the sound, which is really interesting to get more variety in your percussion loops. But let's say I don't want to play around with my keyboard to draw in these individual notes. What you can do then is go into clips over here on the side. You get a ton of different MIDI clips, each of which contains a different groove. So you could take one of these 808 grooves, put them in here. Or you could take a more complex groove. But if you're like me, you're a fan of using sequencers, and there's a really great sequencer by Max for Live, which is also for free, called Rozzer Advanced Step Sequencer. I'm going to load that before the battery device. And right from the start, it looks pretty complicated, but all we really need is this randomize knob here. So we're going to randomize all parameters. And you can see that it also has this velocity panel over here, which is great because we want to be able to randomize the velocity, to be able to randomize the starting position of each sound. So now if we hit play, it already plays us a sequence. Let's open up the battery again, highlight all of the pads, and we can go back into the main section over here and change the envelope settings. So let's say we want more of the percussion sounds to come through. We can increase the decay, also increase the release, maybe even increase the sustain. Interesting. And you can also pitch the samples down over here. So you get more of a lower sound. You can also change the sampling engines to vintage. Vintage I find to sound really interesting. And you also have this stretch warp mode, which can be cool to get more granular and grainy sounds. Let's go back to sampler and vintage and maybe change it to filter high mid. Sounds really organic, really weird and textural. And there's a lot of functions that this device offers you. It basically is like a drum all-in-one processor. You have these saturation modules, lo-fi, filters, compressors, transient designers over here, which can be really cool to shape your sound in the box in one device. We can add a bit of saturation, tape saturation, and compression to make everything feel slightly more glued together as if it's playing as one unit. I'm gonna dial down the threshold here. And maybe give it some transient processing as well. Very nice, very nice. And in my experience, this device does get a bit laggy if you're controlling a lot of samples at the same time. And in order to combat that, you can open up this panel over here, this configure panel, hit configure, and the devices or the parameters that you would like to automate, you can just right click, enable host automation, and it'll pop up in here. Let's go back into main, map the decay, sustain, and also the release to this panel over here. You also have this pitch envelope, which can be really practical to add like a like a pitch at the beginning. Which gives you really glitchy sounding percussions, but we're not going to get into that now. We want it to sound really organic today. So now we can hit configure again. And what's cool is that when we tweak the decay now, or the sustain and these amplitude, these volume parameters, we do that for all samples at the same time. Which is just really, really comfortable. And as you can see in this Rozzer advanced step sequencer, you get these different parameters here, parameter 1 through 5, parameter 1 through 5. And each of these parameters has a step sequencer inside, individual steps that we previously randomized. You can also randomize them here. So we want to randomize parameter 1, and parameter 1 we want to map to the intensity. And by doing this, we randomize the starting position of the sample each time a different velocity hits. So if we hit play, let's increase the decay a bit, let more of the sound come through. And what I love about this is that the percussion groove is randomized, but it still sounds like an actual phrase. It still sounds like something that you can use in a track. And there's so many parameters that you can randomize in this step sequencer. And if I'm feeling lazy, I usually just randomize all. Just hit it a couple times until you get something interesting. Once we've set all this up, we can then create a new audio track, select battery as our input, change it to post mixer, make sure that's on post mixer. You can also select the individual buses here, but that's not something that is interesting for now. Record arm this track and just let it play through. You can randomize along the way. It's honestly really fun. Just have some time tweaking these knobs and resampling your percussion. And you can do this over and over. There's no limit to this. So then what you can do is then split your sound into multiple parts. It's important to keep into account that I'm in 4-bar mode now. So I'm setting splits with Command E. And I'm just going to drag and drop individual slices into new audio tracks like this. After that, you can disable the battery track over here. Hit H to make sure all of the tracks are at the same height. You can highlight all of your audio tracks. Hit Shift and Tab to move into the warping panel here. Change it to beats. You can also try out these different warping modes. I find texture and tones to also give me very granular and offbeat results, but we're going to stay on beat, so let's select beats. Preserve either the 16th or the transients. Let's try transients first. Make sure that you're on forward transient and dial down this slider over here. Let's hit play. I'm getting really inconsistent results, so let's try 16th. Sounds slightly more on grid. And what you can do now is minimize your groove, so maybe just select 1 for the beginning. You already have yourself 1 layer of detailed percussion grooves. Or you can take the second one. Have like interesting percussion phrasing already in the background of your tracks. And again, you can change it to different modes like texture and increase the grain size, the flux over here. Maybe change the pitch. And then combine those with the different loops that you have here. And you can then fine tune. You can right click, go into 16th, and maybe take only the snippets that you'd like. And you can take your time with this. There's no rush. You have all the time in the world. Maybe there's just a certain percussion sound that you like out of all the different sounds that you've generated here. And if you like a groove, you can then loop it and you can then move on to the next section, which is adding hi-hats, shakers, claps, or whatever that you'd like to add. So I'm just going to chuck in a couple samples here to make it quick. I usually like taking hi-hat loops, claps, shakers, like that. Do some quick mixing just for the sake of the tutorial. I'm going to keep it really short here. And at the end, you get something like this. Yeah, I like this one here. That sounds dope. Let's take that, loop it up, maybe highlight the entire section, pitch it down just a bit. One of the reasons I was inspired to create this video is because I mainly do organic house tutorials, percussion grooves and shakers, you know, the usual stuff that you'd include in organic house. But I recently received this comment over here. I'll just blend it in. You can use this technique for any genre. You can use it for techno, hard techno. It really depends on the sounds that you choose from the beginning. So if you're going for techno, maybe choose percussion sounds that sound rather dark and static. Try yourself out and have some fun with this. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to make this project file available on my Patreon page, and if you're interested in grabbing these sounds, make sure to grab them on LotusTunes. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.